I held a necromancy ritual in Iceland once to calm the spirits there, but unfortunately this had the opposite effect, and the bodies of the local graveyard reanimated and came after us. We defended ourselves in a cottage, but the undead bashed through the door, slowly creeping toward us with their horrific groans. What we would do is we'd hit them in the head and then push them out the window. It was a knockdown, Draugr out fight. There are several beliefs regarding the Viking afterlife, but one of the things that needs to be understood is that the heathen concept of the soul was one of many parts, and there are multiple iterations of what those parts were across history. And there does seem to be a you, so to speak, that goes to the afterlife, but this isn't all of you. Parts are left behind. And the Norse seem to believe that upon death, these parts would separate, but part of the soul, that is, the body, would be left behind in the grave. But sometimes this didn't happen quite the way that it should. And there are instances of people who are particularly disdainful coming back in some way. And this is what happened to a man called Thorolf Twistfoot, a man who had showed no mercy, even to his own family. So let's talk a little about who Thorolf was in life. He had what seems to have been a good family. He was an accomplished Viking, a raider. But as he became the head of his family, he thought that his ancestors had not fought hard enough for their land claims. And there was a man next door named Ulfar the Champion, who stood as the only man left in his line. No wife, no children. And Thorolf decided to claim his land and challenged Ulfar to a duel. Ulfar wasn't about to let his cranky neighbor Thorolf bully him around, so he accepted the duel, though Thorolf killed him and took his land for himself. However, before Ulfar died, he struck a nasty blow to Thorolf's leg, permanently maiming him and leaving him with a limp. And thereafter, he was called Thorolf Twistfoot. Thorolf would go on to treat many people this way. He sold land to a former slave, a freedman, who then moved in next to him, also named Ulfar. Thorolf eventually manipulated him, stole his crops, and then refused to pay compensation. He attempted to send his slaves to burn down Ulfar's home, and then when his slaves were killed, he sued for compensation for their deaths, and won. He then followed that up by hiring another man in need of money to kill Ulfar, and finish the job. And then there was his son. Oh, to be this man's son. Thorolf's son Arnkell tried his best with his father. He urged for more peaceful resolutions. And when Ulfar's house was on fire, it was he that put a stop to the slaves burning down Ulfar's home. And it was he that Thorolf sued for the deaths of those slaves. It was to be his way or no way with Thorolf Twistfoot. In his dying days, he reached out to his son to make peace, and Arnkell, being the diplomatic and honorable man that he was, accepted. And he saw his estranged father to hear him out. But as the conversation went on, it became clear to him that Thorolf was just there to manipulate Arnkell into going after another of his enemies, a man called Snorri the Gothi, who Thorolf had convinced to sue Arnkell for the killing of his slaves. And now that that relationship had gone sour, he wanted Arnkell's help. Arnkell did not fall for his manipulation. He simply pointed out to Thorolf what he was doing and said he would play no part in it. And Thorolf responded in a rage, calling his son a coward, that this was always his problem. Arnkell told Thorolf that he can think what he wants, but he's not playing his game. And it was with this that they parted for the last time. Thorolf went home and sat in the high seat without a word to anyone. He ate nothing that evening, and he stayed in his seat after all had gone to bed. And when they awoke the next morning, he was still sitting there, dead. Arnkell was summoned to confirm the death. He crossed the room to get behind Thorolf, warning everyone to take care not to cross his gaze. Arnkell seemed aware that his father's death and anger would affect him in some way. He came up from behind him and covered his eyes, preventing his deathly gaze from cursing anyone. And he took Thorolf by his shoulders, and it took all of his strength to force him down. The wall behind him was removed, and he was carried out of the house. They hitched Thorolf's body to 2 oxen and hauled him to the burial place. They raised a cairn over his body. This was the first funeral of Thorolf Twistfoot, but not the last. It is said that after the death of Thorolf Twistfoot, people found it rather unpleasant to be outside after the sun had gone down. There was an air of discomfort in the surrounding area, and Arnkel discovered that the oxen he had used to move his father's body had suddenly, seemingly without cause, broken their backs and died. Animals that wandered near the grave of Thorolf would howl themselves into madness and eventually death. One night, the shepherd watching over the grounds came rushing home and reported seeing Thorolf in the woods, and that he had been chased by a man who should be dead. He kept doing his job, but after that night he would regularly come home with the same story. Finally, one cold night, neither sheep nor shepherd returned. A search party was formed to find the shepherd. His body was found near Thorolf's grave. Every bone was broken and the corpse was black as coal. His body was buried in a cairn near Thorolf, and as they returned home, they discovered that every sheep they could find in the shepherd's charge was dead, and the rest had strayed into the mountains, never to be seen again. And further, they found that any bird that would land on Thorolf's grave would die the moment they touched the stones of the cairn. Life would simply leave them. Throughout the following nights, people would hear wailing through the night, and people would see Thorolf stalking the countryside. Their roofs would shake loudly without cause, while people inside would cower in fear. The rising tension in the valley affected Thorolf's widow most of all, and she eventually died due to the stress. The body was taken and put to rest with Thorolf in the cairn, and people thought that perhaps it would end there. But oh, it did not end. Instead, it got worse. People started disappearing in the night. Some would escape, but with stories of Thorolf chasing them through the cold, dark night. It became clear that Thorolf was a Draugr, a body risen and hungered. And some would say that they saw those he killed still in his company turn to Draugr as well. People started abandoning their farms, and it was noticed that Thorolf would never bother Arnkel. And he opened his home and people came to stay with him. And it seemed that Arnkel's ability to stand up to his father continued even in death. But it is said that people still held Arnkel responsible, that something had to be done. And as winter came, no one would leave their homes, no matter how urgently they needed to. And finally, Arnkel was convinced the community was suffering, and it was his responsibility to end it. Arnkel decided to move the body to somewhere more secluded. He asked a few men to help. They hesitated, but the law of Iceland was that any men who were requested must help bury the dead. And so once winter had passed and the ground had thawed, they met at Thorolf's grave during the day. Arnkel had brought 11 men with him and a few oxen. They exhumed the body and brought out Thorolf Twistfoot, and they saw that his body had not rotted, but his appearance had become monstrous. They pulled him out of the grave and laid him on a sled, and they had oxen pull his body. After a distance, the oxen couldn't go on, so they had to get another pair and pull the body the rest of the way. But before they got there, the oxen panicked. They broke the harnesses and ran from Thorolf's body down to the shore. They suddenly collapsed, dead. Something strange was happening to Thorolf's body. They were close to the new burial site, but 11 men had trouble shifting his body, much less lifting it. They managed to drag him to a small knoll and just bury him there. And Arnkel built a wall across the knoll so high that only a bird could get across. And there Thorolf rested quietly enough for as long as Arnkel lived. This was the second funeral of Thorolf Twistfoot, but it was not the last. You may notice that I didn't say he just rested quietly enough. He rested quietly enough for as long as Arnkel lived. For years later, as soon as his son died and the cold winter nights returned, Thorolf again wandered the countryside. And people came to a man who ran the farm there, Thorod Thorbrandsson, a man of reputable family, and they told him that something must be done, or Thorolf's undead hunger would consume every life in the valley, man or beast. Thorod decided to cut straight to the point. He went to the grave with a few men. They knocked down the wall and opened up the grave, and there they saw Thorolf Twistfoot, still without rot, but more misshapen than ever. His corpse had darkened to black, and his body was swollen to the size of an ox, and they couldn't move him with their hands. And finally, Thorod got a lever and managed to push Thorolf Twistfoot out of his grave, and they built a pyre nearby and placed him inside. Thorod decided that Thorolf Twistfoot's tyranny would end here and now. There they set his body on fire, and even still, it took the fire some time before it affected the misshapen mass that had once been Thorolf Twistfoot. And a burst of wind came and heated the pyre, finally causing Thorolf to burn. As the wind continued, his ashes started to blow with the wind. The men gathered what they could of the remaining mess and threw it into the ocean, confident that this horror was finished. This was the third and final funeral of Thorolf Twistfoot. Now, Thorod went home, satisfied that he had finished the job. No more would there be a fear of Thorolf Twistfoot. But after arriving home, one of his cows shied away from him, stumbled, and broke her leg. And Thorolf mended her leg since the cow wasn't ready for slaughter, but she would walk with a limp, dragging her leg, and she'd stop producing milk. So he put her out to pasture near Ulfarsfell so that she would fatten up. But the cow kept limping around near the shore where Twistfoot's pyre had been. She was seen licking the rocks on the shore for salt near where Thorolf's ashes had been spread. And Thorod would come to check on her, but one day she disappeared. And Thorod went searching, but he couldn't find her. And he'd finally given up on her when one morning he walked out of his door and there was the cow, limping about in front of his house. He would come to find out that this cow was pregnant. After a time, she gave birth to a pair of calves, one a normal cow, the other a dark bull. And the bull would grow faster than any normal bull. By 3 years old, he was the size of a 5-year-old ox. Thorod was very pleased with this, and he thought it was a profitable venture. The bull was tame as could be and grew so fast, a farmer's dream. And he would name the bull Glaesir. But there was one strange thing about Glaesir. Though he was gentle as a lamb, his bellows would be a terrifying cry, a demonic sound that echoed across the farm. Thorod's foster mother would hear these sounds and warned Thorod that he should just kill the beast or a horror would be brought upon them all. And Thorod placated the old woman's superstition for a time, promising that he would kill the bull eventually, but he could not bring himself to do it. He could breed this animal, and his quick growth would be passed on to the rest of his livestock, and he could be a rich man yet. But even these thoughts would be interrupted by the haunting cries of this monstrous bull in the field. The following year, Glaesir became more aggressive. He would not let anyone near him. Even children would evoke aggression from him, lowering his horns, ready to attack. His cries grew even more haunting and loud, and he would let loose a terrifying bellow, and it'd feel as if he was right next to you, even if you were inside. Finally, Thorod said he would soon slaughter Glaesir, though his foster mother said that it would not be soon enough, that he should have done it already, that he could do it now, but Thorod was insistent, even as their conversation was interrupted by fearsome cries, that he must be rational and wait until Glaesir had been fattened over the summer. That summer, when the hay had been harvested, Glaesir destroyed his restraints and came out into the meadow, and he then attacked the haystacks, getting his horns underneath them and spreading the harvest throughout the field. As soon as he was done with one, he would go for the next, raging all over the meadow, and the farmhands were too scared to approach Glaesir, so they ran to Thorod. Enraged, Thorod grabbed a birch log from the firewood and ran down to the meadow. Thorod approached Glaesir, and the bull turned to face him, and Thorod swung the birch log into Glaesir's face so hard that the branch broke, and this sent Glaesir into a rage, charging Thorod, leading with his horns, and Thorod grabbed the horns and wrestled with Glaesir for a moment, forcing the bull left and right, and he jumped in between the horns and locked his hands around Glaesir's neck, attempting to wear the bull down. And the men watched in horror as Thorod gets tossed about, trying his best to survive. The farmhands recognized that this was an incredibly dangerous situation. They rushed to get their weapons, spears and shields, to take down the bull, but as they returned, Glaesir hooked a horn underneath Thorod and stabbed him deep in the belly. And Thorod, no longer able to hold on, fell to the ground, his belly ripped open. The men charged, chasing Glaesir away from Thorod as he released his final horrific roar. And they chased him until he ran into a bog, and the men watched as the monstrous bull sank into the swamp, never to be seen again. And they returned to find that Thorod had made his way up to his house, and they found him, bled out, in his bed, dead. And here we come to the end of this strange Viking ghost story. Let me know in the comments your thoughts on this one. When I read this story in the Eyrbyggja Saga, I found it so incredibly interesting that I knew I needed to share it on this channel. There's a few little stories like this in the sagas, and each of them is a foggy window into how the Norse viewed the soul and the concept of death. Personally, I just think it's neat that Thorolf was the first man to reach the secret cow level. But with that, hail to my patrons for making this content possible. It's good to have people at your back. Like and subscribe if you want to hear more Viking ghost stories like this, and be sure to ring the bell as it's the only defense we have against the undead. And remember, beware Thorolf Twistfoot.